everyone. I am Mary Davis, Assistant Director at the Center for the Study of Languages and Cultures. And I wanted to actually just do a quick recording that would be an easier watch for those of you that weren't able to join us live when we did this session on the 21st. So I'm recording this a day later. And this is meant to be a post-friendly version so that you can still stay on target with like what we talked about and the kinds of exercises that we did and follow along if you like. So this was the first day of our little mini series for R.U.N. And this is all about facilitating our own intercultural understandings and our own intercultural development. So what we focused on this day was really digging into and having discussions about how our own culture shapes our world. I'm going to give, just a little bit of background. I do think in this setting, some of the feedback I've gotten is that it seems like you guys appreciate having a little bit of background in theory, but this is by no means a lecture. This is meant to be a place for us to connect and work together. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes doing some just sort of informative background where I'm coming from and what I think is useful for today. And then I'll kind of walk through some of the exercises, at which point you can pause the video and do them on your own. If you're watching the video with somebody, pause it and have a discussion with that person. If you want to go, pause the video now and drag somebody in from the hallway, have at it. And we have two different activities that we focused on. And then I'll leave you with some discussion questions, things for you to think about, or if you're a journaler or you're a runner and you like to have thoughts while you're exercising, or you want to journal about something later, or you just want to ruminate on it. These are things that we, the types of discussions that we have in these spaces. So I'll leave you with those prompts. So this is just going to be a little bit of culture general background, right? Starting with the theory, a couple pieces of information that I think would be useful. And then I'll certainly provide some links if you want to do some follow-up reading on any of this. But I always kind of like to do a little warm-up icebreaker. So we have, actually don't know if I launch the poll, if you would be able to see it in a recording. Let's try. No. Okay. So I would have launched a poll just to kind of see where we're all at. And the first is a multiple choice select all that apply, where intercultural development requires A, that you be a seasoned traveler, B, that you speak multiple languages, C, that you have lived experience of being in diverse and multicultural spaces, D, all of the above, or E, none of the above. All right, so this is also, I like to kick us off and just sort of make sure that we're all understanding what I mean when I say intercultural development. So this is not actually a passive skill, right? This is not something that just by virtue of having traveled, lived, or worked abroad, a person would have or not have. This is something that we have to actively work on. And the trick of it is that we all actively work on it in different ways. I mentioned journaling and running and conversations and stuff earlier, and those are all examples of what it might look like to engage in that way and develop those skills. But that might not be what it looks like for you. So for me, I like to just sort of sometimes I journal on and off. I like to sit and quiet and think, but it is an active, intentional thing that I'm doing. And that's why we have these spaces too, the R.U.N. series, so that you have a space to do this with other people, especially if you're a person that likes to talk through and have conversations to get those multiple perspectives. So for the quiz, definitely not, intercultural development does not require that you've ever even left the country. It doesn't require that you've ever been in a multicultural or multi-ethnic environment. It requires that you have engaged in this type of thinking, this reflective, kind of self-critical, analytical thinking. And it's not correlated or related in any way to a person's age or nationality or their education level, or anything like that. Sorry. So we have students for sure who are more interculturally competent than we are, and some that are not. And we're all kind of moving at our own pace, but it does not have anything to do with your lived experience in at least a time context, right? If part of your lived experience is that you've done a lot of this active reflective work, then yes, it would, but not necessarily just these demographic things. So like I said, that's why we're doing this mini series, so that we can connect. Hopefully you find it useful. If you stay tuned through the end of the video, I do really appreciate your feedback, so we can see what is useful to you and we can adapt accordingly. Obviously, I work in the Center for the Study of Languages and Cultures, so the little bit of background information that I'm bringing for today when we're talking about meaning making and shaping our perspectives is a sort of linguistically founded angle. So you may or may not be familiar with what we call the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. These were two very early on linguists, and basically linguists I'm using loosely. I believe one of them was a fireman by day. So this is a 100+ year old hypothesis that was an observed way of thinking that a person's mother tongue, native language, would influence how they perceive the world. And the kind of go-to example for this is in many cultures where they live in a very cold environment where there's a lot of snow, like we're thinking of Siberia, some of the first peoples in like northern areas of Canada, for instance. A lot of times we'll see represented in that language that there are multiple words to refer to snow, right? It's not just snow, there's different varieties and different distinguishments, right? So the thought was, because they have a language that has 17 different words for snow, they must perceive snow differently than, say, somebody who comes from a more tropical environment that's never seen snow. There would not be such a distinguishment, right? And so that definitely relates to when we think of how we perceive and make meaning of the world. Does our language inform that? And I don't really want to be a champion of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. It's problematic in its own way. I like our little political cartoon over here that has some native people saying, "Did you know that suburban white males have over 100 words for lawn?" Right? So we don't want to think that just because somebody speaks a certain language that they think a certain way, but I want to kind of broaden, the root idea, or what I'm kind of sussing out is the root idea of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that there is something, some part of the human experience, whether that's linguistic in nature or experiential. I'm going to be referring it to largely as a cultural thing, because we're here for the Intercultural Development R.U.N. series. But there is something that influences the way that we perceive the world around us, right? That we would perceive, for instance, snow to be different. Or very well, we may have lawn enthusiasts who can tell the nuanced differences between the types of grass, and is it local, is it imported, was it sod, right? That doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your native language, but it does have something to do with you and potentially the cultural groups that you are a member of, right? So instead of saying that this is 100% related to somebody's linguistic background, what we can say is that culture is something of a filter, right? That if our culture is the direction from which we are approaching a scenario, our cultural groups or affiliations may indicate a probabilistic inference for how we are going to interpret that scenario, right? So if somebody is coming from the east side of the screen, then there's a probabilistic inference that we could make that they're going to perceive this number to be a 6 or a 9 relative to somebody coming from a different direction, right? So that's what I'm trying to get at in terms of the background of culture shaping our world and our meaning making, a lot of it has to do with this idea that there are many cultural identities that we all hold, and that means that we're all coming of and making different meanings, and ultimately experiencing our own experiences, sometimes completely differently. Mhm. So if anybody celebrated Holi, I believe this is actually a picture of a color run, but it's hard to find. Um, I'll show you in a second why exactly. But Holi was celebrated recently. It's a festival of colors and kind of a welcome of spring. And if you were to go and see like an outdoor celebration of the holiday, you might encounter something that looks something like this, right? You see a lot of the colors being thrown around and on clothes and people. But if you are a member of a certain experiential group, you might see, something different, right? So there's this expression, a picture is worth 1,000 words, but which words are we using, right? Um, that first image, I might have used something like, colorful, and for this one, that word doesn't necessarily come to mind. And this is the same image, but altered through the lens of someone that has red-green color blindness, right? So this was obviously like a biological reason to literally see something differently, but it's a good metaphorical representation of how we can all view one particular instance, the same scene even, and walk away with it, or walk away from it with different interpretations, different explanations of what's happening, and different evaluations. We can feel very differently about it. So all of that is to just sort of get us in this mindset and then prepare us for our discussions. So this would be one of the points where if you have somebody that you'd like to talk this through with, that's good. This is also a good solo activity. This is just sort of to warm up and apply some of this background knowledge to what we're thinking of today in terms of making meaning in our own world. So you will need a scrap of paper. It doesn't have to be a computer-sized paper. You can get a Post-it or something. I'd recommend something maybe a little larger than a Post-it. Right. And you're going to take just a minute to draw it doesn't have to be very pretty. You don't have to keep this or show it to anybody, obviously, but it's going to be a flow chart of sorts. And you're going to start with one big circle in the middle. And that's where you're going to write your preferred name. Right. And then we're going to move out from that chart. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. So you are the first tier, the middle core, right? And then you'll draw a couple lines out from you into other circles. And those circles are going to represent groups that you belong to, right? And we're expanding how we think of culture here. It's not like necessarily your ethnicity and nationality exclusively, right? Groups that you belong to can be any group that you belong to, that you share behaviors or experiences and values with other people in that group. I'll show you an example in a second. And then we'll actually go one tier further. We'll go even into the third tier and think about what sorts of experiences and behaviors we personally connect to our identity with that cultural group. And then we'll take, we would have taken a moment in breakout rooms to discuss what those things mean to us. But feel free to just take a minute to think to yourself, or even discuss if you have somebody sitting next to you watching the video with you. So you can draw something like this, right? Your name would be in the middle. You're the first tier, the core, and then a couple of lines with other smaller groups or circles going out. And you're going to put cultural groups that you belong to. So for me, for my example, what I'm going to show here, I picked two groups to use as an example. One is that I am a female person. I identify as being part of a cultural group that is women, and I'm also a parent. Right, so these are two groups that I hold membership of. That for me, when I'm thinking of like specific behaviors or values connected to those identities, for me. It can be, very different than if you're like a parent or a woman that's watching this. That doesn't mean that we have the same values, but for instance, one behavior that I think is connected to my identity as a female person is my preference for parking underneath like the lights in a parking lot. This is something that I was taught and learned how to do. It's a safety thing, and it drives my partner nuts because I will park further away so that I can be in a well-lit area. And he wants, like the closest parking spot because this is not a behavior that he has. So for me, like that's connected to my group identity of being a woman, because I was taught as a woman, you should, park in well-lit areas. Um, Another a ritual that I have is celebrating Galentine's Day or Palentine's Day, right? That's something that I think, it's not to say that men can't or don't celebrate it. It's just that something for me, I celebrate with my group, my friends that are typically also in this cultural group of women and female people. And I put TV shows and movies as well because that's a behavior or a preference that like I think can be influenced by if you're thinking of the stereotypical like chick flicks or something, you might associate that with part of your identity. I'm specifically thinking about saw like a meme or something that said, the women like watching crime documentaries and like this true crime TV. And I've been on quite the kick of watching documentaries about serial killers lately. So, maybe that specific behavior is somehow connected to my ownership and my membership, sorry, in the the cultural group of being a woman or female person. That same thing though shows up. I also attach TV shows and movies to me being a parent, right? And this is the connection here is different, right? It's not because I like watching what my kids watch. Like I don't prefer to watch Bluey and Cocomelon and Paw Patrol. But my identity as a parent means that I do watch those things because it's yeah, if I wasn't a parent, I don't think I would sit down and be like, let's turn on some Boss Baby right now. But it does, my identity as a member of that group of parents means that I exhibit certain behaviors like watching children's TV shows. And I also have certain affective behaviors, right? Or certain impacts that I feel like in myself and personally have developed, but I think I share also with other parents is like a developed anxiety of parenthood. You're responsible for raising and protecting a small life. So, these are things that for me, I wanted to give you some examples of what that looks like. I invite you to pause the video, write down 5 cultural groups, write down more. But think about, those top 4 or 5 that come to mind and try to think of for you a couple of key behaviors, rituals, values, experiences that really represent what that group membership looks like for you. And this kind of helps us make more tangible what our perspective taking and meaning making is being informed by. So I'll give you a moment to pause the video here, and then we'll pick up in a minute. Okay, so some of what we would have discussed in the breakout rooms when you share, 1 or 2 of your cultural identities and experiences or behaviors connected to that identity is what is that connection between the group and the behavior for you, right? So I'm using this example here that I had given of me belonging to the group of female people and exhibiting the behavior of parking by lamps or in well-lit areas of parking decks or whatever it is, and thinking about, okay, so what really is that connection? Why is this a behavior that I associate with this group? Is it a behavior associated with other groups that I'm a member of? Is it exclusive or unique? Is this just a personal behavior? Or is this something that I know other people of this group, other members of this culture also do, and think about what is really the relationship. Are you seeing any themes between the behaviors and values or experiences that you've mapped out? and the identities that you hold. And if you do see some themes, right, of particular values that you hold, even values that you've been taught or learned, a lot of our, culture and our meaning making comes from what we implicitly and even what we explicitly were taught in our formative years, right? Like I have very clear memories of being explicitly taught, like when I'm driving a car, like where to park my car and how to hold my keys and things like this. That maybe women that aren't in areas where driving is popular, right? If you grew up in a large urban area where public transportation was sufficient and most people don't own cars, this isn't necessarily an experience that we share or both connect to, our shared cultural group membership. But maybe it's represented in another way, right? So kind of questioning what that relationship is, what really is represented by the connection between tier 2 and tier 3 can help us dig at what we're bringing to the table and what direction we're coming from when we approach or we encounter something, much like the example of the multiple perspectives, the two people looking at the number on the ground and seeing two different numbers. If we think about it in this way, we can think about what our direction is coming from and how might that be shifting what we're seeing and experiencing, and therefore shaping our world. So that brings us to our final group activity. So this would have been something I adapted from the Purdue Silmar. They have a lot of online resources if you're interested, if you work with students and you're interested in getting some ideas for, intercultural activities you can do either with them or just for yourself. They have a great resource called the Hubicle. And this is one of the activities I particularly like. One, because it's a bilingual activity, but also because it's very relevant to us continuing this conversation about culture, representing our perspective, or informing our perspective taking as we are making sense of our experiences and the world around us. So I'm going along with the same theme of keeping in political cartoons, and kind of bouncing off of the theme of my own personal chart that I made, where being a female person, a core identity or a cultural group that was prominent for me, right? So we have two women clothed very differently, having very similar thoughts, right? So in this case, the experience that they're having is actually quite similar. They're each sympathizing for another woman, feeling that woman is being, potentially like oppressed or objectified by a male dominated culture, and yet they're seeing two different things. So I like this one because it kind of encompasses the reverse of what we've talked about before, where we can see the same thing and come with two different perspectives. We can also actually share a perspective, but see two different things. So our activity here is to first kind of think about what, if we hear the phrase perspective taking, what that means to you. Thinking about what kinds of interactions you have or have had that have required you to take on the perspective of another person. And what did that look like for you? What did that feel like? Was it difficult? Why did you do it? What was the result? And then also thinking about, in that context or just at large, how taking on that different perspective impacted your communication with that person. Did you adapt what you were saying or doing? Have you adapted not just in that context, but moving forward? What sorts of things are we taking away from those interactions, especially in the sense of communicating with others? So feel free to pause the video, reflect on these, journal it out, discuss with a partner if you have a partner nearby, to just reflect for a moment and think about what these answers would be for you. Okay. And this is the activity from the Purdue Hubicle that I mentioned from their Silmar institute. So basically, they give you an utterance, right? Which is when he, she, or it woke up, the dinosaur was still there, right? And this is adapted from a Spanish graphic novel called El Dinosaurio. And that's the utterance that you are going to see. And I'll show you the actual context in a moment. But when you just see that phrase or hear that utterance, what comes to mind for you? What do you think is happening? What information do we have from this utterance? When he, she woke up, the dinosaur was still there, right? So think about, what these words represent to you, what that first or couple first images are that are being evoked. For most of us, for me at least, and from based on the conversations that we had in live version of this workshop, we might imagine something like this, maybe different dinosaurs, a T-Rex or a Stegosaurus or something, but something like, okay, well, when he, she, it woke up, that person must be in bed if they're waking up. The dinosaur was still there, and it's a literal dinosaur. I've been reading a lot of books about dinosaurs with my kids, so it's not hard for me to imagine a dinosaur in a bedroom, because that's basically part of our daily reading at this point, right? But if this is something like what you imagined, it's probably being imagined from your own perspective, right? You are the viewer here, or the reader. You are watching he, she, it wake up and see the dinosaur still there, right? And think about too, okay, what kind of dinosaur was I thinking of if this was your image, or if not, think of the image that you had thought of, right? Is what's happening here, right? Is this a funny story, and the dinosaur is a pet dinosaur, and the kid loves the dinosaur, they have a positive relationship? Is it a recurring nightmare, and it's a T-Rex and you woke up and it was going to eat you? What's happening between he, she, it and the dinosaur for your understanding? And then we're going to actually entertain four different depictions using this exact same narrative of he, she, it woke up and the dinosaur was still there. And think about what this means in the context of perspective taking. So this is something we would have done in breakout rooms. Feel free to just follow along as you like, right? So here we're asking ourselves the same questions. This is one of the author's depictions of when he, she, it woke up, the dinosaur was still there. And from a linguistic perspective, the reason they say when he, she, it woke up is Spanish, being the original narrative language, is a pronoun, a drop language. So there's not actually a he, she, or it here. It's just kind of like when woke up, the dinosaur was still there, and the pronoun is implied. I believe. I'm not a Spanish speaker, but I know that linguistically about Spanish. So please feel free to correct me if I was wrong there. But, looking at this representation, this graphic, whose perspective are we seeing now? What's the role of the dinosaur in the relationship between the character and the dinosaur? How has this changed, or how does this differ from the original perspective that you had conjured in your mind? And sometimes it helps to just sort of jot this down, like a couple words that come to mind when you first see the image. Basically, these four images and comparing them. So if you did jot down your notes, take a look and see what kind of words were you jotting down. What kind of feelings did you have each time we looked at a new dinosaur? Did any of these make you take on a new perspective, right? And especially that last question that we kept asking ourselves when we looked at the graphic novel, dig into that too, and think to yourself, especially if you had the opportunity to discuss with somebody else, why was my opinion maybe different from somebody else's? What experiences, if you're thinking about that third tier, what experiences or even cultural group identities do I have that might have been influencing my interpretation of what's happening here, right? A former McDonald's employee, right, or an artist, or a current teenager, or a parent might have many different interpretations based on their experiences, from somebody who's not in those groups, or somebody who hasn't had those experiences for yourself. And then if you did get the chance to share with another person, or even just reflecting for yourself on how it felt to think about your perspective on these images, like how might it feel when somebody does share your perspective? They came to the same conclusion when you showed them that photo, and they were like, yeah, of course I agree with you, that's what's happening here. Versus maybe if somebody didn't agree with you and they say, I don't understand how you came to that conclusion, I think it's very clearly this is what's happening here. And contrast those feelings. How does it feel when somebody does agree with you and when somebody doesn't? What's your like first affective response to that? And how does that apply to our whole conversation today about culture shaping how we see the world, and how taking perspectives can influence our communication? And hopefully the larger takeaway would be a practical application for, does this change the way that I communicate, on a more regular basis? And thinking about these things. And there are no right answers. This is, some of these questions might have a lot of thoughts and things for you to say, and others might not. But I do encourage you to dedicate a little bit of time to each of them, as we would in our R.U.N. Actual session, and talk through it with somebody. Write something down, think about it for yourself, and do that active work. Because it is sometimes very insightful. And at worst, it's just a new way to think about things. So thank you all so much for watching. I hope it was useful. I hope to see you next Tuesday at the second day for R.U.N. And especially if you watched the video, I want to see if these are useful. If you want to either scan the QR code or go to the bit.ly short link, I'm open to feedback. It should be anonymous, so my feelings, well, I don't know if my feelings will be hurt. I guess it depends on what you say, but I won't hold it against you. Couldn't if I wanted to. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you at the next R.U.N.